LSU just outright stunned Florida in the Swamp last night. 37-34 for those of you who couldn't see it due to fog. 23-point favorite. Some are arguing this is one of the biggest upsets in the history of the SEC. In conference play, considering what was on the line, I'm not so sure you're wrong. And I've got several things to say about this game. Most people expected a blowout. We didn't even predict this game last week, so I'm certainly not talking to you sarcastically because we saw this coming by any stretch of the imagination. But how crazy was this, really? Well, I'll tell you, I was looking at Bill Connolly's stuff earlier today. Occasionally, I'll reference his post-game win expectancy rate. And this is a very sometimes entertaining metric. It's a valuable metric for future predictability's purposes, but essentially what it's doing is it's ingesting all the data from the game except the final score. So it's looking essentially at the football game through numbers. And it's asking if this game, if this set of data, if this football game happened 100 times, what percentage of the time would the winner win the game? So LSU won this game last night. How often would they win this game? How about 0.6%? It's the lowest post-game win expectancy rate of the college football season, even lower than that miracle Texas pulled out against Oklahoma State. Crazy, crazy stuff. Like I said, I understand why a lot of you were expecting a blowout here. Number was 23, and the last thing you had seen from LSU was you had seen Alabama paint the walls with their blood the week before. So you just assumed, well, if Alabama did that, even if Florida's not as good as Alabama, I mean, goodness, LSU was a little more than a warm body last week for them to pound on for 3.5 hours. This will be a walk in the park. Well, I want to take you back to that Alabama-LSU game for a second and explain to you why this ended up not being a walk in the park for Florida. You remember the game, you remember Devontae Smith lighting it up, and you remember the stats just kind of like that. It was like watching that thing on Price is Right. The wheel just goes and goes and goes. You remember all that. What you may not remember is that little incident in pregame. 2 hours before kickoff, Nick Saban walks in the stadium. Jamie Erdahl of CBS catches up with him. And he said, we talked about it on the show last week, he said, you know, I'm pretty sure LSU thinks they can beat Alabama tonight. These are Nick Saban's words, by the way. He said, and that's why we're going to have to come in here and we're going to have to change the way they think. That was the mentality Alabama had as a 30-point favorite. They were looking to come in there and completely and utterly salt the earth and everything in front of them. And that's what they did. When you think like that, and you have superior culture, and you have superior players, you can run over people like a tractor combine. But here's the problem. Dan Mullen did the opposite. Dan Mullen allowed his team to show up last night, assuming his opponent was already defeated. And they weren't going to have to do the work like Alabama did. Alabama shows up knowing, all right, we got to change the way they think. And once they don't think they can beat us anymore, then we've dominated them. Dan Mullen, apparently, and Florida, right behind him, show up last night and think LSU's going to get dominated tonight. Well, there's a crazy thing that has to happen. You actually have to do it. You have to do the dominating. It's a point spread doesn't do anything. The point spread's only there because of the assumption that, well, you can take care of business by an odds maker. And so who is this on? I know a lot of you have been talking about Marco Wilson today, and I know a lot of you are talking about kickers and all this stuff. There's Collins showing you the shoe throw, defense, Todd Grantham, this and that. Let me ask you something. Do you really think that that's where this game was lost? Is that what you think? I don't think that. I've watched it already again today, and I'm of the opinion that a lot of this was decided before I even turned the game on last night. When you show up, I don't care what point spread is on a game, when you show up and you haven't mentally prepared yourself, you can't do it midway through the first quarter. There is no fabled post-game or, well, not post-game, there is no fabled halftime adjustment you can make. Once you get yourself in the soup, you're in the soup. And they weren't playing UT Chattanooga, for example. They're playing a team in LSU. It's got some athletes. They've underperformed this year, but the athletes are still there. And so it was pretty obvious early on. Florida probably in a little bit of trouble here. I'm going to get to Florida in just a second because I got a lot more to say about them. But I think I got to give a lot of credit to LSU because it's been a bad week down there. It's been a really bad week. There is still a lot to deal with at LSU. But see, I had a guy come at me yesterday, and he was talking about meaningless games and folks opting out. And he asked the question in a rhetorical manner, well, why wouldn't you opt out for these meaningless games? Well, some folks have opted out because they do view the remaining games on the schedule as meaningless. But I want to tell you something. There are enough folks out there who are of the mentality that as long as they're keeping score, then it means something because they're competitors. And that's how they're wired. Not everyone's wired that way, but enough folks are wired like that to where not only are they going to show up, and not only are they going to pour it out on the line, even if their record indicates maybe to you at home on your couch that game's meaningless, well, they think differently than you. And they show up differently than you, and they're on the field and you're on the couch because they're different than you. And to them, they're ready to go to war because it still means something. And here's the funny thing. Once you remove some of the elements from the locker room that are of the opposite mentality, some of those folks who think it is meaningless, then you can have one of those old addition by subtraction formulas. And that's what happened with LSU last night. You got a freshman, most of you have never heard of him at quarterback. They got scholarship numbers bordering on not even enough to play. And yet once they had some folks walk out of there that you think is going to be just detrimental to the odds that they could even compete here, not only do they compete, they win. Now make no mistake about it. As much credit as is due to that team from last night, well, it doesn't change anything about the future for LSU. It certainly changes things in terms of that staff understanding who they can trust in the foxhole and, more importantly, perhaps, who they can't trust in the foxhole. And that's a future personnel decision thing. But also, it doesn't necessarily change a lot of what is messed up about LSU behind the scenes. There are a lot of things that still need fixing. They're going to need to overturn a lot in and of themselves in order to be competitive next year and years to come. All that's true, but it certainly leaves a lot better taste in your mouth than what the alternative is. And secondly, I think it probably sells a lot of people down there that had been on the fence over the last week about whether a vast majority, a large swath of that program had tuned Ed Orgeron out. At the very least, it has to confirm in your mind, well, that's not true. Maybe rumors of an entire mutiny, an entire uprising, maybe those were greatly exaggerated. Maybe there were some isolated pockets. Maybe some of them walked away. Maybe there was some self-policing going on at that program, and the best ones were able to do that. And maybe last night was just a small result, and hopefully an indication of what you could have coming. So there was a lot of college football playoff talk after this, obviously, around Florida. And as much as you guys were talking about the Marco Wilson shoe throw last night and everything like that, you know what was to me, one of the most inexplicable things that I heard in this broadcast? It wasn't the post-game scene that Dan Mullen made. It wasn't the shoe throw. That stuff, yeah, everyone heard that. I heard something that not a lot of you were talking about. During this broadcast, if you had the TV feed up and you had the audio on, the broadcast crew was openly talking about conversations they had had with Dan Mullen and Todd Grantham during the week about playoff scenarios. And I'm thinking to myself, what in the world are they talking about that for during a game week? They're not guaranteed anything. I can't remember the last time I turned on an Alabama game and a broadcast team details 30-minute conversations they had with Nick Saban about how they think their playoff seeding is going to pan out. In other words, taking your opponent for granted. I think this was one of the most humbling nights of Dan Mullen's career. He was in wounded animal mode. He was in full defense or denial mode in his post-game press conference. I didn't even bother to tell Colin to clip from it. It's a waste of time. You can go find it if you want to. It was fairly pathetic. I mean, the thing about it is the guy made some accurate points in his post-game, but yet it was so childish that no one really cares to hear it from him. Like someone else can make those points, not you. This is the same guy who complained about the size of the crowd at Texas A&M after they lost, and now it's, well, maybe we shouldn't have been playing this game. Well, okay, Dan, listen, let someone else say that. Please just let someone else say that. But this was very humbling because he knows, trust me, he's keenly aware he didn't have his team ready to play last night. He had his team thinking that LSU was going to come in, they were going to put up a good, solid pushback, they were going to get some good work in against them for about a quarter and a half, and then they'd run up the score, and then there'd be a halftime decision about whether to leave his starters in or not. You're not Alabama. Florida's not Alabama. Obviously, in terms of personnel or in terms of internal wiring. They don't think like that, is my point. So if they don't think like that, you certainly can't afford to think like that. The entire reason they are who they are is because they don't think like that. Like, that's the whole point. So then you have the college football playoff conversation. And to me, I'm not all that focused on it because I don't think it's going to be relevant for more than 1 week. The conversation essentially is, well, can Florida still get in after they win, or if they win the SEC championship game? Can they still get in? Like, what would have to happen? Friends, There are few truths in this world, but I really think one of them is I don't think you're going to have to worry about that after Saturday. I really don't. Now, having said that, I think a lot of you are going about this argument from the wrong perspective. A lot of you are going at the 10 games played versus 5 or 6 games played thing with Ohio State. If we lose 2 games and they're 5-0, shouldn't we still be in because we put ourselves out there more? That's not the way to make the argument. I understand what you're saying. I've told you I think there's merit on both sides of this. Here's what you should do. You should talk to the side that's defending the Ohio State stance, and then look on your side at the side that's defending the we played more games, therefore we should be rewarded for that stance, and you should say, well, let's find a compromise. Okay, you guys over there, let's say you're talking about Ohio State. You guys have played, 6 games after the Big Ten title game? 6 games? Okay. Well, here's the compromise. We'll just find our best 6-game stretch from this year, and we'll let that be our sample size versus your sample size. So games we played versus games you played. Now, Florida's got a 6-0 stretch, obviously, in their schedule. And then we can compare resumes. That's the way you should go at it. Because if they're going to look back at you and say, no, you got to count all the games you played, well, then you enter into a little bit different discussion. Having said that, though, like I said, I don't think it's going to be relevant. This is something that's going to sting. I got to refresh the computer. This is something that's going to sting for a long time. So I want you to think, as we close this and move on, I want you to think about what your perception of Florida was just 24 hours ago, going into the LSU game. You obviously expect them to win that. Even if they're just competitive against Alabama, they've got the SEC East. They were in the playoff conversation right up until the very end, maybe even after the SEC title game, depending on the way the rest of the country shook out. Recruiting has been as good this year as it's been at any point under Dan Mullen. And so you feel like there are several rungs that you're about to climb up on that ladder in years to come. Now, you imploded in the biggest moment of the year to date. You are in all likelihood going to be run by Alabama Saturday, and I think that was going to happen either way, but in all likelihood you are. Never assume. We saw last night what happens when you do that. And Georgia has surged at the end of the year. And so I was wondering, and I'm still wondering, as we get out of this thing, what looked like a quantum leap for Florida and maybe kind of a reset button hit in the SEC East and a reassumption of the top of the mantle for Florida. I wonder if it's really even going to feel like that. When we get done with this, is it really even going to feel like Florida's the better team in the East at the end of the year? They still beat Georgia. They still got the SEC East crown. I'm not taking that away from them or anything like that. I'm just saying the way you thought you were going to feel at the end of the year as a Florida fan versus the way you're in all likelihood going to end up feeling could be night and day different. And it's all because you allowed yourself, not as a fan, but as a CEO of that organization, and Dan Mullen, you allowed yourself to show up thinking you already had an opponent beat. You can never, ever, ever let that happen. The thing about it is, a lot of coaches have done that before. They have suffered at the hands of assuming before and allowing complacency to set in. It's just normally it happens way out of the spotlight, really early in your career. Most of the time, you're not coaching a top 10 program that's in playoff contention when you allow that to happen. So that was a tough thing to watch last night. Really, really tough.